Today we're going to be learning Masechet Moed Katan Daf Yud. We're continuing with the Mishnah that we were discussing. We're now up to the case Hahidyot Tofel Kidarko. A regular person is allowed to sew on Chol Moed because, again, we were discussing this idea of Maaseh Uman. If it's something is done in a professional manner, it's a problem. If it's done in a regular manner, it's not. Certainly, if you go by my sewing, it will definitely be considered a Maaseh Hahidyot and not very professional. Hechidami Hahidyot. So how do we know if someone's a Hahidyot? A professional is someone who can do this. Okay, it's not clear what this is. Different interpretations. Today, especially, we're going to have a lot of different interpretations about what each thing is. We'll try to keep it simple. We'll go with Rashi. Rashi says, you basically put, I think it's Rashi, right. If you put, you do a lot of stitches, the length of the needle, and then you pull them all through at once, almost like a sewing machine would do. A lot of stitches all in one go. That's as professional. If you're not doing it in that way, you're already considered a Hahidyot, so you don't need to get down to my level to be able to be considered a regular person. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina amar, kol she'eno yachol lechaven imra bechefet chalukot. He has a different interpretation. If you can't sew on, apparently they would do some extra patch that they would put on. Rashi says, it's a thick, okay, it's harder to sew something very thick. It's some thick piece that they put on their clothing. As you can't sew it properly. Okay, exactly. The reality is a little bit not 100% clear to understand, but it sounds like they would add something to protect from getting dirty or something like that. They added a particular piece of material, and basically you would do it in a way that on one side it was shorter, on one side it was narrower, on the other side it was wider, just came out not very professional. V'ha'uman machliv. If you're a professional, how can you sew? Well, you can do what we call machliv. Now, machliv sounds like from kelev, from a dog. What exactly this means, we're going to have to figure out. My machliv, Rabbi Yochanan amar mafsia. Mafsia means you don't do it straight. Okay, again, different interpretations. Many people say your stitches aren't even. You do a long stitch and then a short stitch, and then a long and then a short, and they're not very even. Rabba bar Shmuel amar shinei kalbata, like the teeth of a dog, that are higher, lower, higher, lower. Your stitches go higher up, lower, higher, lower, higher, lower. Misargin et hamitot. You're allowed to stretch these strings on the bed. Okay, their beds were these frames. If you look in the picture is very helpful. It was a bed frame, and you would put strips or ropes going one way, and the ropes going the other way. You pull it taut. So we're going to call shti and erev, warf and woof. And you, sorry, I think it's having some tongue twisters here, warp and woof. And basically, right, which is the way you do the weaving, in and out, over, under. And you would then stretch them. So now we're going to learn that there's certain things you can do and there's certain things you can't do. So we have a machloket in the Mishnah, misargin et hamitot. Let's just go back. And it says, Rabbi Yossi omer mimatchin. You can stretch, but you can't do the sriga. So we're going to have to understand what is the sriga exactly. My misargin, my mimatchin. Ki'at Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, he told us from Israel, told us what they said there. Pligeba, excuse me. Pligeba, Rav Chia bar Abba b'Rabbi Asi, u'Travayim mishmei deChizkiya b'Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so these two people argued, and they argued based on a machloka between Chizkiya and Rabbi Yochanan. Each one brought a different opinion. Chadama, one said, Misargin shtiva erev. Okay, you do it in both directions. That's misargin, where you strand them this way and then you strand the other ones the other way. Umimatchin shti below erev. Mimatchin is where you do only shti and not erev. So one says, right, you can do, remember, misargin et hamitot, you can even do sriga. The other one says, no, you can only be mimatchin, you can only do the shti, not the erev. Now they say, according to the next option, chadamar misargin shti below erev. Misargin is shti below erev. You for sure can't do shti erev. But the Tanakama says you could do shti without erev. Okay, you could do the first way, but not the second way, right? You do your strings first one way, then you do it the other way. So what's mimatchin? Then exactly how it sounds. You stretch it taut so that it's right after you strand it, then you have to kind of pull them tight so that you can actually sleep on the bed. because on that, people would sleep on those, right? Either you put some straw down or you put something on your bed and lie on that. Ini. So now they're going to question. First, they're going to question the first option, and specifically focusing on the mimatrin is this rafoi mimatcho. If it was not taught, you would be able to tighten it. And that, remember, everybody agrees you could do that. Ini v'hatani Rav Tachli Farber Shaul, he brought the following braita. Vishavin, both of them agree though. Now, this is a machloket, whether you can do masargin. Right. The second opinion, Rabbi Yossi said you could only do mamatrin. The first one said you could do masargin and obviously mamatrin. But they both agree, you can't braid the ropes in the first place. Let's say you don't have a braided rope to put on your bed. You definitely can't do that according to all opinions because braiding is an issue. So that's already hard work. Again, we're all right. I didn't mention this whole thing, but the question is, what kind of work can be done? This is what we've been discussing all along. What's considered a tircha yatera or not? So to braid it is already more of an issue. So bishlam alamanda amar misargin shtiva erev and mimatrin shti below erev. Right? If you're going to say, let's go up a level. Mimatrin, you can do the shti without the erev. That everyone agrees. The machloket is about misargin. Right? Can you do shti and erev or not? And then they all agree, though, you can't go up another level and braid the ropes. And then it makes sense. But Ella Lamanda, and then Hainu de Katani, Rav Tachli Farber Shaul, that's where he comes in. It says Vishavim, but they all agree. She'em afshilin chavalin lechatchila, right? That you can't braid the ropes. But Ella Lamanda Amar misargin shti below erev, and mimatchin shimaya rafu aya mimatcho. But if everyone drops a level and permits less, then shtiva erev amart lo. According to the second interpretation, no one allows shtiva erev. You can only do, right, either pull them tight, according to one opinion, right, Rabbi Yossi, or according to the other one, you can pull them tight and you can do the shti, but not the erev. So if you hold that, shtiva erev amart lo. If you can't even do the shtiva erev, you can't do the warp and the woof, you can't do both directions. Chavalim lechatchila mibaya, of course, then you can't braid. Why would you even need to mention that? What they really should have mentioned is everyone agrees that you can't do shtiva erev. So it doesn't make sense that they kind of went up 2 levels, to which they say kasha. So we raised a question against the second interpretation that, again, mimatrin is just pulling it taut and the misargin is shti below erev. We brought a question and we actually end with, this is in fact a good question. Second, now we're going to have a question on the fact that misargin is shti below erev. Again, within this opinion, we're going to question that part of it. Does somebody really say that misargin could be shti below erev? The Hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir Omer, Hamita mishi yisrog ba shlosha batim. This is something entirely different. We're talking about, when does a bed become a bed? When does it become something? Once it's a bed, it's considered something significant, and then it can become impure. It can become susceptible to impurity because it's a kli. If something is not called a kli, it's not a vessel, it's not something real yet, then it can't be susceptible to impurity. So Rabbi Meir says, mita, bed, becomes susceptible to impurity when, now, really, we don't care about the content here, we care about the wording. Mishe yisrog ba shlosha batim. When you do sriga, which is our verb, 3 batim. What does 3 batim mean? It means 3 rows where the shti overlaps, where the erev overlaps the shti, okay? Where the warp and the woof overlap in 3 rows, right? Let's say you have your shti going the one way, the long way, and then in the short way, right, you go in the other direction, you go 3 already of the string of the erev, then already you've got your shlosha batim, okay? At that point, your bed is, even though you don't have the rest of the bed, you have enough to call it a utensil. But what do you see here? Lisrog is the putting the woof, the woof, and I'm always confused which is which, but I should really check my wording, but I don't have it in front of me, but one of them into the other, the warp into the woof or the woof into the warp, right? It's basically making sure, I know Julie would be disappointed, should have done my research before I taught this, but basically, right, I know the basic idea that one goes into the other, right? One of the strings going one way, one of the strings going in the other direction. So now, how do we deal with this? So when Ravin comes, he says, basically, that's not a good interpretation. Misargin, for sure, based on what we just saw, cannot be shti below erev, that you only did 1. So Ella, Ravin comes from Israel, and he says, B'misargin, remember, Rav Dimi came first and brought the machloket from Israel. He comes and says, no. B'misargin kulei amalu pligi dishti ve'erev. Everyone agrees there has to be both, the warp and the whoop, the woof, the warp and the whoop, the warp and the woof. But Ella ki pligi b'mimatrin. The machloket is when you do the stretching. Mar savar mimatrin shti below erev. What is mimatrin? So there they still have a machlok. Is it shti below erev? And mar savar shemaya rafoy mimatcho. If it was just loose, you can tighten it. Okay. So we've basically narrowed the machloket according to Rabban, because three guys clearly both directions. Therefore, it can't be that Misargin is a debate about it. Misargin is clearly shti and erev. The machloket is only this mimatrin. The Rabbi Yossi says you can only do that. Is it that he thinks you can only stretch out if they're already on there, or does he agree that you could do the shti without the erev? Marsaval, I'm sorry. So that's now we've narrowed it. However, we're still going to have a question on that, because we're going to question, could it really be if it's loose, you can stretch it? Because we're going to bring a brayta that seems to contradict. Meitibe. Meitibe is a word that introduces a brayta that contradicts a Tana's what an Amora said. So now, our Amora said, right, or one of our interpretations is that the Amoraim think that Mematchin could be just stretching it. Taught. Misargin et amita ve'en sarich lomar shemematchin. Okay, according to this, right, Misargin, this is what we just saw. It's not said in these words in our mission, but it's basically, right, you can be Misareg, and obviously Mimateach. If you can do Sriga, you can for sure do Miticha. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Here our Tanakama appears in the name. Rabbi Yossi Omer Mimatchin avalo Misargin. Okay, so far that matches. We haven't learned anything from there. Here's a third opinion. Ve'yesh omrim ein mimatchin kol ikav. Some say, however, that you can't even do mimatchin. To which the Gemara says, that's not going to work with that second interpretation. If you're going to say that mematchen is shti below erev, so the Yesh Omrim says, no, we don't even think you could do shti below erev. But you think the Yesh Omrim are really saying that you can't stretch it taut? Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, if you already have the ropes there, it's not a big deal to do this. And you can't actually sleep in your bed if you can. So it's Litzarach HaMoed. It's needed for the holiday. It's not a lot of work. So it doesn't make any sense that anyone would forbid it. If you just had our Mishnah, so we saw that everyone says you could be Mimateach, and then it would make sense. But according to this source, Yesh Omrim said you can't do it. It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't be allowed to do this. How else are you going to sleep in your bed? To which the Gemara answers, no, you could say this is what it means. Kevan de efshar lememalye b'mane lo tarchinan. Imagine you have these ropes and they're not so taut. What could you do? You could take some sheets or clothing, something, put them on top of the ropes, and then when it basically starts leaning down, right, or sinking, right, you basically start sinking into the bed. Well, you'll have a layer of sheets, towels, clothing, whatever it might be. You could fill it in, and then you can sleep on top there. So you actually have a good solution even for that, in which case we might say, could be the Yesh Omrim think you can't even stretch them tightly. So with that, we've resolved, and we still are left with Misargin is clearly shti ve'erev, and Mimatchin is either shti below erev, only the first direction, or it could be tightening the ropes that are already on. New Mishnah. Ma'amidim tanur v'kirayim v'reichayim b'moed. You can put together, okay, it's unclear, machloket, what exactly this means. You stand it up. Does it mean you stand it up, put it in its place? Tanur and kirayim are different types of ovens that they would use, like with burners on top. Rashi says, tanur tocho chalul mikom shvitat shtei kterot, where it's empty on the inside, it's hollow, and you put on top, kind of like a stand, and you put on top of that two pots, two burners, like you have fire underneath two spaces. Kira is makom shvita k'zera achat. So he says a kira is for only one. There's a bunch of different opinions about what exactly each of these are. The idea is you can put them up, kind of take something, turn it upside down, right? Put the fire underneath. Or maybe it means you can attach it to the ground. Maybe that's what ma'amidim is, and you can't actually build it, right? The question is, are we actually allowing building, which would be going far? Or we're not exactly allowing building, but we're allowing kind of taking it and attaching it to the ground. Birei Chaim are millstones, where you have a big stone at the bottom and another stone on the top with a hole in the middle. You can look at the pictures and get a sense. So Mamidim Tanur v'Kechaim Birei Chaim b'Moed. You can put these up. Rabbi Yehuda, again, same thing with the Rechaim. What exactly you're doing is not 100% clear. Again, are you attaching it to the ground? Are you putting one on top of the other? They're big, very heavy stones. So it's a little bit of work here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, En mechabshin et ha-Rechaim b'tchila. Okay, we're going to see what is mechabshin. We're going to have to understand this after. So after is right now. Gemara starts, my mechabshin. What is this mechabshin that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow? Rabbi Yehuda Amar. This is not the same, right? Rabbi Yehuda is the one in the Mishnah. Comes Rabbi Yehuda to explain Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, minakel rechaim. Okay, it's making the hole in the rechaim. Minakel rechaim means that the two stones rub against each other. But what happens is after time, it's so smooth and you want to crush, right? What you do is you turn the top stone and it crushes everything in the middle because of the two surfaces rubbing against each other. But the problem is that over time, if they get too smooth, it's very hard to crush them. So you want to have these nicks. So you can make little nicks and indentations in the stone in order to allow it to be more pressure on the grains that you put inside and it'll crush them. Rabbi Yechiel Amar bat Eina. He says, no, it's the hole that goes in the middle. What happens is there's a hole in the middle of the top one. You throw the grains into there and then that helps, then the grains get to the middle in between the two, and then you crush them, right? You turn the top one around and that crushes them. So he says it's making that. So those are the two possibilities as to what Rabbi Yehuda does not allow. Meitive. But now we're going to bring a contradiction. We'll see in a minute against two. Ma'amidim tanur v'kirayim b'moed. U'bevad sheli gmor malachtan. You can put up a tanur and kirayim on the holiday as long as you don't totally finish it. You can't have a finished product. That's already more of a problem. Tivrei Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim omrim af yigmor. The rabbis say you can even finish. Okay, this doesn't get connected. Rabbi Yehuda omer mishmo ma'amidim et hachadasha u'mechabshim et hayishana. He says you can put up a new one, and you can do mechabshin, which we're going to see what this is, to an old one. Okay, so now v'yesh omrim, hold off for 1 minute till we say it. Ein mechabshim kolika. There's one opinion that says you actually can't do kibush at all, even in a new one. Now, what we have to find is a case of mechabshin that you're going to do to a new one and to an old one. That makes perfect sense with minakir, that you put these nicks in, because you could do it in a new one that's totally smooth, or you could do it in an old one that became smooth over time to make it work better. Then we have a case of an old one. We already have a hole. It starts out with a hole. You can't have a millstone without a hole in it. So why are you adding a hole to an old one? It's not possible. To which the Gemara answers, what it means is you want to make the hole wider. Let's say it's a narrow hole. You want to widen it. That's what he says you can't do to an old one. Or again, Rabbi Yehuda says you can do it to an old one. The Yesh Omrim says you can't do it at all. Rabbi Yehuda says you can do it to an old one. You can't do it to a new one. So what he means is you can't widen this old one. You can't widen a new one. You can't make a hole in a new one because that's already serious, but you can widen an old one if it's not wide enough. Rav Huna Shame Lahu Gavar, we're now going to have a case. He was making these holes in the Rechayim on Chol Moed, which again, according to the Yesh Omrim, you can't do. Okay, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda also says, so maybe, right, it sounds like maybe he would only allow it in an old one, but anyway, it seems like according to the Yesh Omrim, for sure you can't do this, assuming that's how you define mechabshin. So let's see what his reaction is. Amar man hai itchil gufe de kamachil chola de moed. He says his body should be desecrated because he desecrated chol moed. He was very upset that this person did this on chol moed. Savarla ki yesh omrim. He held like the yesh omrim, as we saw, that em chabshim kol ikar, and therefore he thought he couldn't do this. Darash Rav Chama nokrim rechaim b'moed. Mishum Rabbi Meir amar afilu. Okay, so now Rabbi Chama says, though, you can make these holes in the rechaim on chol moed. He disagreed. And Mishum Rabbi Meir amar afilu sus sherochev alav v'chamor sherochev alav mutar li tot zipornayim b'cholosh moed. Okay, this is a totally non sequitur, but because we're talking about things you could do on Chol Moed, so they quote here that not only Nokrim Rechaim b'Moed, but Rabbi Meir said that you can even take a horse that you're riding or a donkey, and you can cut their toenails because it's very hard for them to walk if their toenails are kind of getting in the way. Aval Chamor de Rechai. Now we see why we got to this, because the Chamor of the Rechaim, you can't do this. Because what's the issue? Now the issue is you're only allowed, we weren't talking right now, we were talking about setting up the millstone. But the question is, why are you setting this up in Chol Moed? Because you need to grind your grains. But you're only grinding your grains for what you need for Chol Moed. So you don't need a lot. So if you have a donkey-led millstone, which is, how does the millstone turn? Well, some sort of either water, animal. If it's pulled by an animal, that animal won't need to work so hard because you're only doing it for a small amount of grains. And therefore, you can't actually cut the toenails of the donkey for the millstone. Rav Yehuda Shari lemishkal torfe lechamra derechaya. Okay, now we're going to see a whole bunch of things that he allowed. Rav Yehuda permitted people, okay, we're going to have a long list, to take the torfe, cut the nails of the chamor of the rechaim. He even says this is allowed. Uleukume rechaya, to put up the rechaim, okay, to set up the millstone. Ulemivne rech, okay, so leukume maybe is to put it on the ground. Lemivne is to put maybe the top part on top of that. Okay, again, there's different ways, right? Rashi says leukume is to put one on top of the other. Ulemivne amat rechaya. Okay, the amat rechaya is the wood. They put a wood board. You can see this in the picture also, a wood board that they put the rechaim on top of. So it wasn't straight on the ground. So you can put that up. Or you can even build it, it sounds like. Ulemivne oria, you can build a refet bakal. That's what Rashi says. You could build a barn for your animals. Some people say there's no way that that's what it means. Maybe it means a trough, because it wouldn't make sense that you'd be able to, a barn is a big construction job. We wouldn't necessarily allow you to do that on the holiday. It seems like, though, if your animals need it, you're allowed. Again, different interpretations of whether or not you're allowed to. I just have to see this bed refers us to, right, it should say Rav here. It says Rava, but it should say Rav. Rav shara l'seruche susia. You can comb the hairs of the horse. Ulemivne artafita. You can build a trough for the animals to eat. Which obviously then makes it a little difficult. If you already talked about a trough, why are we talking about a trough now? Which is why Rashi's interpretation may be a little bit better. Again, the Rashi that appears here on the page, not the actual Rashi. Ulemivne itzteba, to make a stone bench. Rav Ashar lemishkal dama lebehema b'chola demoeda. He allows you to bloodlet an animal if an animal needs it. Amar le'Abaye tanya de'Masayeh alach. Abaye says to Rava, I'll bring a braita to prove. It's nice. They often argue. In this case, Abaye says, I'm going to prove what you just said from a braita. Mikizin dam lebehema. There you have it. You can bloodlet for an animal. Ve'ein mon'im refuah lebehema b'cholosh hamoed. You can't prevent any sort of medicine for an animal in Chol Moed. Anything the animal needs for medical purposes, you're allowed to do. Rav Ashari lekiskuse kirme. Okay, he allowed, this is something that has to do with clothes, something after the washing process. Either it's softening the clothes or it's ironing the clothes. He permits that. My taima maseh yotu. He says this is, again, we're back to beginning of class. Is it something every person does? Yes, it's not a professional type of thing. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ami, Amar Rav Chisda, kiture bere aser, to basically straighten out, to make pleats in your sleeve, something like that is forbidden. My time, umanhu. That's already something that's a specialist type of job, and therefore you can't do it. Amar Rava. Rava is now going to give a whole list of things, and they're all going to have a similar structure. You'll see right now. Mande matkil ara adate debeidari shari. If you're taking takal, is from takalot. You're taking out obstacles in the ground. You're cleaning up the ground, taking things off the ground. If you're doing it, adata debeidare shari, if you're doing it to create a flat surface of a threshing floor, you're allowed to do that. But adata da'ara, but if you're doing it for the ground, to flatten out the ground, then it's asur because it looks like you're plowing. You're basically doing what plowing is, which is preparing the land for planting. So hechidami. So how do we know what you're doing and what's going to look like you're doing it for the ground or you're doing it for the threshing floor? Mulia b'mulia v'natza b'natza adate dbeidari. If you're taking it from a high place, like a mound of dirt, and you're putting it on another mound, then or you're taking natsa b'natsa, it's in a ditch and you're moving it from one ditch to another ditch or from a low place to a low place, then it's fine. Then it's obvious you're doing it for the threshing floor because you're basically taking it out in order to have space there. But shakamuli avashada b'natsa, adata da'ara, but if you're taking it from a high place and you're filling it in a low place, then if you're taking basically dirt from one place and moving it to another place, then you're basically flattening out the land. And then, right, it looks like you're filling up your hole at the bottom. Looks like you're doing it for planting purposes. V'amarava, haiman dezache ziche. Okay, if you're, actually, one second. Just want to check. It's called tikla. Sorry. I did it a little bit. Matkil tikla is really that Rashi says you're digging up dirt. The trees and taking off twigs is really the next thing. Okay, so tikla is really from you're taking mounds of dirt and moving them somewhere else. Okay, that makes more sense. The next one is you're basically cleaning out, you're cleaning out, taking off all sorts of twigs from the ground. So again, adata ditzivi, if you need the twigs for making a fire, sharik, that's obviously allowed to do on Chol Hamoed. Adata da'ara, but if you're cleaning up the ground, asir, because again, it's going to look like you're cleaning the ground to plow, right? For like plowing. Hechidami. So what's the case? Shaka river zutre. If you take the big pieces and leave over the little pieces, adata ditzive, then it's clear you're doing it. Because if you're leaving the little pieces, then that's not really preparing the ground. It's obvious you want them you're taking the big pieces for firewood. Shakal ravrave vizutre. But if you take all the big pieces and the small pieces, adata da'ara, then it looks like you're doing it to clean the ground. The amarava, another case. Haima de patech maya la'are. Adata de kvare shache. If you make a little hole in the ground to collect water in it, okay, you make a little area where you're collecting water. If you're doing it for a fish pond, okay, what are you doing basically? You're taking you're channeling water from somewhere else, like a stream, and you're making a hole that it's going to come into your hole. That's allowed because if you want it for fish, okay, you want basically the water to come in, and then you're going to basically see where there's fish in there and take the fish out and eat them. But because that's for the need of the holiday. But adata da'ara, but if you're doing it, you're collecting water for the ground, asir, then it's forbidden. Hechidami, so what's the case? If you open two openings in this hole, one is coming from above and one is from below. That basically means you're bringing the water into the hole and then you're letting the water out. And what's going to come out through that hole? Only water. You're going to be left with fish. Then it's obvious you're doing it for the fish. But if you only have one opening and the water's only going in, but it's not going out, adata da'ara, you're obviously doing it for the purposes of the land. The amarava. Haima de pashach dikla. Okay, more cases. This is case number 4 of Rava, if I counted correctly. If you're pruning a dekel tree, a palm tree, adata de chevata share, adata de dikla asir. If you're using it because you want it to use for your animals, okay, that's what Rashi says. You can use these for your animals to eat. Then you're going to take them from wherever, okay? But, well, we'll see in a minute. If you want them for your animals, it's fine. But if you want them if you're pulling them to make the tree grow better, right? You take off all your dry branches, then it's a problem. So now they say, how do you know? If you take them off from one side and you're not really particular, right? You're just taking them all off from one side. It's obviously you're giving it to your animals. But but if you're taking some from this side and some from that side, basically meaning that you're really just looking for all the dry ones and pulling them off, adata de dikla, you're obviously doing that for the tree, ve'asir, and it's forbidden. Ve'amarava, furthermore, he says, hane tamre tuchlane, if you have unripe dates, migzerinu share, to cut them in half is permitted and eat them. Maitzinu asir, but if you try to preserve them, that's forbidden. Because why? How long does it take to preserve? It takes a while. You'll already be done with the holiday by that point, and it's a problem. Because you can't do this unless it's for the holiday. But Rav Papa Amal, kevan demitle kiprakmatya ha'aved dame v'shav. Since if you don't preserve them, they're going to get ruined. This is like davar ha'aved, something that you'll have a big loss. Therefore, you're even allowed to preserve them on Yantif, even though they won't actually be ready until after. I'm sorry, not Yantif, on Chol Hamoed. This is, by the way, interesting because let's say you want to pickle something on Chol Hamoed. Are you allowed to do that if it's only going to be ready in another week once Chol Hamoed is over? So here it seems to say, if let's say you have cucumbers that are going bad and you want to turn them into pickles, if that's your purpose, then yes. but don't go buying things and pickling them if your point is just to eat them after the holiday. Amar Rava. Another thing he says, this is a little different than the structure of all the other ones. Pragmatia kol shu asur. Any kind of business is asur. This is already very interesting. There's a bunch of reasons as to why. Some people say this is a tircha, right? Nobody likes to go to work. It's a headache. So you shouldn't do any business dealings. It's called tircha. It's a work. You shouldn't be doing it. Some people say, and this I think many will relate to, you might get upset doing a business deal because sometimes you might sell for not enough money. You'll be upset that you didn't sell it for as much money as you wanted, or you might buy something for too much money and you'll get upset about that. Often business deals end up having some sort of, even if you're happy you sold something, you might actually be somewhat disappointed that you didn't get exactly as much as you wanted. So because of that, it has this, right? We want to create an atmosphere of simcha, of happiness. We don't want, right? Maybe from here, you might think you can't sell stocks on the holiday because, you never know. You might get upset. It might go up right after and, you might have a huge gain, but then you'll see the next minute it went up 50 points. And you'll say, oh my God, I should have waited. I can't believe I just did that. And you'll be upset. So we can all relate to that kind of a thing. Some people say, if you go by the tircha, well, maybe you could do a little bit of work, but then they say, okay, this is good for workaholics. Once you start, you continue. And if you start engaging in business dealings, you might end up getting carried away and doing other. So there's all sorts of questions about why exactly this is a problem and where the limits are. He says, well, it depends if it's davar ha'avid. Let's say the stock, you have a sense that the stocks are going to go crashing down tomorrow, then maybe you could sell because that will be a huge loss, or any kind of business dealing. Maybe, it's going to be today or they're not going to buy the company. So you say, okay, we're going with it now because we don't want to have some sort of, any problem could come up. And by the way, you can probably many times come up with a situation as to why this would be davar ha'avid, not always, but possibly. He had a business dealing where he was going to get 6,000 zuz. That's a big business dealing in those days. But he pushed it off till after Chol Moed. And he ended up selling it for double the price, 12,000. This is the classic story of the Gemara where they want you to see if you keep the halacha, you will be rewarded financially, right? The story is probably an exaggeration, right? But it's a good exaggerated story. You'd like that to happen to you. Next, Ravina have a masik zuze b'bnei Akka d'Shanvata. Okay, he had someone who was owed money from the people that lived on the banks of the rivers of Shanvata. Ata the kameder of Ashi. So he went before Rav Ashi, and it was Ravina who had a loan out by someone. Okay, they owed him money. He says, can I go get the money back from them? So according to what we saw before, maybe not. This is a little different. This isn't business dealing. This is getting his money back. So Amarle, since these guys are here right now, and maybe you won't find them next time, right? It's not so easy always to collect your money. This is like davar ha'aved v'shaveh. And what we're going to see in tomorrow's daf is Tanya Nami Gabe Avodah Zarah Ki Agavna. We'll start with this tomorrow, where we'll see by Avodah Zarah we have a similar heter. The issue by Avodah Zarah is totally different. We're talking about buying and selling things on the holiday of the idol worshipers. Are you allowed to buy items from them on their holidays? We'll talk about what the whole issue is tomorrow, but we'll see a similar answer given to here about it being davar ha'aved and therefore permitted. We'll end with this for today. Shabbat shalom, Shavua tov to everyone.